structures, i.e. dams and levees, are prohibited from using CDBG-DR funds to enlarge a dam or levee beyond the original footprint of the structure that existed prior to the disaster event. So if you're wanting to enhance that dam or that levee, you're not going to be doing that with these funding. Okay, and it can't be like a match to do for that funding either. It's specific to restoring it to what it was before. I swear there's a reason why I have this piece of paper. Yes, ma'am.
Cynthia, I have a question on the attendant functions. You mentioned certain things were functional and some things were not. And among the things you mentioned were the restriping and the repaving. So are you saying that you can't use federal funds to restripe and repave, or you can't restripe or repave at all?
In a floodway.
In a floodway, but the road is not going to be abandoned. Aren't you creating a safety hazard by saying we're not going to restripe it or repave it?
Well, what the problem is that it's not me, I swear. The problem is that they don't want to have anything built in a floodway. The preference would be to remove that road from a flood. I mean, think about it. A floodway is the river, okay? So if you're dropping down into the river for whatever reason, that's a hazard. They're looking for you to elevate over that. That would be much more likely what they would be.
So you could apply for a grant to raise the road, perhaps, but you can't repave the road.
So it would basically be a road bridge is what you're looking at. So if you're doing something that's dropping in, they're trying not to encourage that because there's a danger to that. Okay, there's issues that go on to that, so they don't want to perpetuate that. So again, they're not looking at that thing. That's why it's got funny stuff about repaving or striping or things like that. They're talking about things that are specifically not a floodplain, a floodway. And remember, a floodway is where it comes together like you're sitting in a river or a stream or something like that. Now, I know that when we're crossing it,
right,
we could be dropping down into that, but really what should be in place is some type of culvert that they're riding over, and you're preferring that they're up and above. Okay, so it may be that kind of build out. I'm not an engineer, so I can't say exactly what they might utilize. But again, that's why they're not encouraging, the road that's dropping down in there for those people to continually have that road washed out. I mean, it's stunning when you see how much force water has and how it can destroy so easily when it gets going, the velocity that's involved.
Right, I'm sure they, as you explained, I think they're considering the velocity of the water. I'm thinking of people who rage about the fact that there's all the water in the streets. Well, the streets are detention ponds, and at certain points, our detention pond streets do cross floodways.
Probably true.
And we have areas in Houston which are in the underpasses, for instance, that are 7 feet underwater, even during a heavy rain. And to say that you couldn't maintain those or do something about those.
Well, and that's where that individual question like that probably needs to be something that we actually get a scenario and send it to HUD and ask them for specifics. Good idea. I don't want to say never, but on a lot of this stuff, they're very firm.
Right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll add to that just a little bit.
Please add to it.
Yeah. So
she created that list, by the way.
Did. Based on experience, because we had a project, another Josh Jackson project. He's like the one-offs we get. That it was a long project that had certain things happen in a floodway, certain things out of the floodway, certain things in the floodplain, and it was what I at the time thought to be a safety hazard, which was big potholes on an existing road that has been in a floodway for a long time, an asphalt road, and we went to HUD with it. I argued that it was functionally dependent in the sense that it was a safety hazard, and my argument was wrong. It was denied, and we weren't allowed to do it. So. Things that you probably think are a safety hazard for the traveling public, especially for existing infrastructure, you'd think logically that would be allowed, but HUD funding is reserved for federal actions and activities that are going to benefit and get people out of the floodway and floodplain. So they're not saying, there's no reason the county that you're working for, the RE, could throw in some money and fix that area of the road, and you can do everything else outside that with HUD money, but those specific activities won't be allowed.
Well said. Alrighty. Yeah, I was reading off a list that she created. That's why I was like, I've never seen that before, and I would have never thought of a road in the floodway. So again, and just kind of these are the last little slides that we're going to do for floodplain. And if you have any kind of specific questions, please feel free to ask. And you're welcome to email me those questions as well. I don't think I mentioned it at the very beginning. I'm actually a certified floodplain manager. So if I don't have the answer, I certainly have a bunch of people I can kind of tack into and ask for help. Requirements for flood control. Grantees that use CDBG-DR funds for levees and dams are required to, number one, register and maintain entries regarding such structures with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, National Levee Database, or National Inventory of Dams. Number two, ensure that the structure is admitted into the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers PL 84-99 Rehab Program, Rehabilitation Assistance for Non-Federal Controlled Projects. And I recognize this because this comes straight out of the federal regulations. Number three, they have to ensure the structure is accredited under the FEMA National Flood Insurance Program. Number four, they have to enter into DRGR systems the exact location of the structure and the area served and protected by the structure. And five, maintain file documentation demonstrating that the grantee has conducted a risk assessment prior to funding the flood control structure, and documentation that the investment includes risk reduction measures. And we can kind of guess why that's in there. All righty, we're going to jump into historic, and I'm actually going to make Celine come up here. She's our historian. And because I'm running out of water and I can't talk very much anymore. You're in charge. Hey. Oh, by the way, as she's walking up, I'm just going to let you know, I had a message from one of our projects from the Water Development Board that says, in response to their notification, after review of the information provided for possible activity in a floodplain, our findings indicate that the city of, as a participant in the National Flood Insurance Program, has authority for projects within its jurisdiction. Please ensure all project activities are in accordance with the local flood damage prevention ordinance requirements and the community mentioned, as well as any other community participating in the NFIP that your project may occur within. So Water Development Board, who kind of is the master over all that we do over this stuff, is trying to point that back out to you guys, floodplain manager, local. Good.
Okay, well, I'm going to talk about our programmatic agreement we have. So I didn't know I was going to be talking, so just bear with me. Surprise! We worked closely with the Texas Historical Commission, and we got a programmatic agreement together about a year ago, and this is to help facilitate get expedited reviews. So normally when you submit something to the Texas Historical Commission, it's 30 days, but under the disaster recovery, working with them, we can get it expedited to about 14 days if all the information is included. And when I say that, if you get comments or questions from the THC asking for more information, more clarification or whatever, please respond in a timely fashion, because otherwise you could find yourself being moved over to the 30-day review period. So please be aware of this. In our PA, we've asked that, and we're requiring that you have SOI qualified historians, architectural historians, or archaeologists. This also helps facilitate being able to identify the resources correctly and efficiently. Another change we've implemented, or something we want to let you all be aware of, is when you go look at the age of your buildings, we all know you use the tax records, the CAD cards, just be aware that the dates can be off on the construction. Sometimes they're off as much as 25 years. So you could have a building constructed in 1920, but maybe they added an addition in 1985. Well, now the tax card says the construction date's 1985, and that's not right. So just be aware of that. And I also wanted to mention that thanks to SWCA, one of our vendors, we've had them gather information and put together a huge database with all the eligible, potentially eligible, and listed resources. So we've got that information, because when you go out in the field, please be aware of not only are you looking at a building if it's historic age, but look around the surrounding area too, because it could be a historic district or a potential historic district. I'm trying to think, is there anything else you wanted me to?
Can I go over some of the things on the PA that are okay with any specifics?
Let me see.
Maybe age of the structures.
So, the age? Okay, so we've got a 45-year cutoff period. Normally, if you've worked in historic preservation, it's 50 years, but we've added a 5-year buffer. This is some of the other state agencies that do that in case the projects get held up, your building or your resources covered for the historic age. Some of the concerns that we have with historic buildings that are eligible or listed, You'll see this in the disaster recovery, are the windows. So that can be an adverse effect if those are changed using unsympathetic materials. So that's why we ask you to come forward early on in the process, work closely with us and THC so we can work out something, because this could be an adverse effect otherwise. I'm sorry? That's something that we're still in the process of finalizing. Cynthia asked me to mention the historic districts that we've been working on with THC. There were several of them identified in Ike, in Orange, Port Arthur, and Beaumont. Since 10 years have passed and there have been some more storms, a lot of these houses have undergone more changes, and THC just recently went out there to reevaluate the potential, or the original potential historic district boundaries, and several of these have been shrinking. This hasn't been finalized. We're meeting with THC next week to discuss their findings and go over these districts. Some of them either have been shrunk or they may not even be historic districts anymore. And what that means for you all in those areas are, if there's a house that was in the original potential historic district and it's now, the district boundaries have shrunk, then this will be good, so your building can keep moving through the process and not be held up while we work with THC to resolve any potential adverse effects. Okay? Yes, Sam?
What's the process for achieving Section 106 compliance under the programmatic agreement? Do we go through the E-Track system, and what do we include?
So when you upload to eTrex, and eTrex is the database that THC uses, there is the one feature for disaster recovery is the drop down that's, I believe it says Harvey. Is that right, Rob? Yeah, Harvey. That will alert THC that you are working for disaster recovery and that this needs to be an expedited review of 14 days. And right now I think that's the only one they have identified, but they said we could use Harvey for other disaster recovery as well. So just be aware, even if you're working on 2015 and 2016, you can also use the drop down for Harvey. And please include, we've got like site-specific forms. Please include as complete information as possible. You'll want your project description in your site-specific form for what goes to THC to match what's in your overall site-specific. That way the THC is aware of what's going on. If there's, if you're replacing siding, windows, or whatever, this needs to match the overall application so that we can have internal consistency and THC is aware of any potential issues. Anything else? We can also share the PA if you don't have it. Yes, Rob?
It suggests it's just for a lot of people, local districts, and what should be done.
Wait.
We gotta record you.
One of the things that has come up on a lot of programs, and just suggesting to Celine, local districts, what the Texas Historical Commission does for Section 106 compliance is, am I speaking loud enough? Is to do it at that high level, but the local districts that have defined a specific historic district within their area have their own historic preservation commissions, and they will also have specific requirements. They will be the ones who are issuing the demolition permits and the construction permits and evaluating the design. So I just wanted to also just quickly mention that.
Right. Thank you. Okay. Any questions? Oh, okay. How do I? Is there a clicker? Is there going to?
Yeah, right there it is.
Told you I was surprised. Okay. So we've gone over the 50-year requirement, which we're going with the 45-year. Talk with the SHPO. Resources can be building sites, districts, or archaeological sites. So I can talk about archaeology here in a little bit. And like I mentioned, we're looking for eligible or listed or potentially eligible or listed. So those are just to kind of let THC know what's out there. We've talked about the typical 30-day review period, but we've got with the PA an expedited 14-day review. And like they said, complex projects can take longer. It can also take longer if you don't provide enough information up front. And don't leave THC guessing. Make sure you provide a detailed project description, your photographs, maps, I'm trying to think, yeah, good architectural descriptions, maybe what's been identified previously in the vicinity. And this is what Jill whispered to me, cemeteries. So, this is more archaeology. I mean, you can do above ground. They could be eligible above ground, but the bigger issue with cemeteries, when you see an old cemetery, is they did not all stay within the boundaries. So if you have a road project and it's close to a cemetery and there's a fence, probably not everybody's in the fence. There's probably a bunch of people outside the fence. In fact, generally they are. So just be aware that if you're out there and you see an old cemetery, that you're going to have to coordinate with THC, or at least talk to them. They say if the project is within 15 feet of the cemetery, you need to have a professional archaeologist go out there and look at it. So I would recommend, if that's the case, get working with them early on, because you don't want to have to move and relocate bodies. They can go out there, they'll survey it, they'll work with THC and take care of the cemetery question. Let's see. Are there any questions about cemeteries? That's your biggest one that's going to slow a project up. It's either, even if it's like a historic cemetery, or even a traditional Native American cemetery is even going to slow it up even more. So just be aware and come forward early on if you find something like that. We're back on the PA, okay. And then we're back to noise. Okay. Any questions? What about? Oh, okay. Let me go over I'm not an archaeologist. I do above ground, so it's, you know. Archaeology, as you know, there's a restricted atlas, and only archaeologists can access it. So it's top secret. They know where all the sites are, what high probability areas are, usually around streams. I think that's the big one. I don't know, Rob, is any other high probability to be concerned about?
Yeah, so the programmatic agreement, there's additional discussions, and as Celine said, it's within, they use metric for archaeology too, just to make it a little fun, but 328 feet or 100 meters of a natural waterway. So if your project is that close, and it's going to be, if new construction are exceeding 20% of the original footprint, then you'll have to consult with THC on archaeology. And then that restricted database that Celine was talking about, SOI qualified archaeologists can access it by request to the THC to get access. And any project that's within 100 meters or 328 feet of a known archaeological site will also have to be consulted with.
Right. Okay.
Any other questions on archaeology, I guess?
Well, I was going to also say they may have to coordinate with tribes, but that's also outlined in the PA.
No, the PA actually does not outline the tribal consultation.
Okay.
So Native American tribes are a separate entity under Section 106. They do have to be consulted pretty much for any project, and the consultation period is at least 30 days. Cynthia talked about the TDAT, the tribal directory that's available through the HUD website, and you can choose the county location you're in, and it will tell you which Native American tribes need to be contacted about your project. Anytime that there's new construction, essentially. If it's a rehab project, you'll generally won't have to, but if it's a new construction or a reconstruction, multifamily infrastructure, you generally will.
Okay.
Sam had a question.
Sam always has a question. While she's walking over there to answer the question, I'm going to make this comment for tribes. On there, you need to ensure that when you are submitting the letters or the documents that you're sending over to them, you're sending them letters and maps and any other pieces that you might think that are appropriate to go with them, so they understand exactly where you're looking at. When you're doing that, HUD does have a template of a letter that it kind of outlines what it is that you should be supplying to them. You need to give them a good project description on there. They need to know exactly what you're doing and locations. The other side of this is when you're addressing it, even though on TDAT it may list 2 people on there, it's going to be either, and it depends on how their tribe does it, whether it's a governor, a chief, or president. On that's the person you address the letter to. You copy the TIPO, okay, but you always address the leader of that tribe. That's how you address those. Don't address it to the TIPO and then copy the governor of the tribe. That's disrespectful. Okay, so you always are actually addressing it to whoever that leader of the tribe is, and you are copying the tribal historic preservation officer if they have one. They may also list out another email that they have for submissions. On the other side of that as well, you are submitting to them. They have it laid out in the TDAT. They have faxes. They have emails. Create the letter. Have it signed. It needs to be signed by certifying officer, somebody to that extent, somebody as a manager or something like that. Please don't make it the secretary. That's inappropriate. It is coming from the RE, not from the consultant, so it's got to be a signature and on letterhead for that. From the RE, it's got to be from city or county, because we are guaranteed a government-to-government review for the tribes. So that's something very important. The other side of that is you are able to take that letter and fax it to them if they prefer, because they'll have a fax number for some of those tribes. The other ones also prefer to have it emailed. If you're going to email it, don't send a hard copy, because that becomes confusing and they're getting a lot of letters. So choose which way you're going to do it, and make sure you save a receipt to that so that you can prove out that you submitted these to the tribes. Number one. Number two, please don't call them unless you absolutely have to. It's kind of inappropriate to call them up and demand that they respond to you. It's very disrespectful. When we're dealing with the tribes, we are trying to show them the utmost respect, okay? So if they choose not to respond to you for that full 30 days, too bad. Poor planning on your part. You should have gotten that out to them. When I'm creating that environmental review, the first thing I'm looking at is historic, because that's one of the things that's going to take the longest. So you're going to go ahead and look at that first. So please, 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 if you are calling to ask them, you ask them incredibly politely if they can possibly do this for you, because you're trying to do whatever. But you never demand things. You're never inappropriate to them. They don't have to respond to you if they don't want to, okay? And don't lay it out to where maybe they'll respond that 30th day and request more information. Here comes another 30 days. So again, just always remember the utmost respect when you're contacting these tribes. And they prefer to contact you through correspondence. Sometimes they'll call you to ask for something. Many times we'll get a letter back asking for a little bit of additional information, and a few have actually required that we send them copies of the environmental review itself, and I've actually had one so far that has asked for an archaeological survey. So it just depends on the areas. And be cognizant of those areas. One of the projects that we were looking at, it would have been a quick Google search to figure out that, oh yeah, they have a big thing out in this area. You're working in the same areas over and over and over again, so kind of familiarize yourself. Google that tribe and see if it shows you specific areas that they're kind of keen on. The funny part was, literally, as you're talking about bodies of water, the area that they were looking at, and it was not just historic but prehistoric that they were looking at, was near a lake, okay? And it was all the area that was near the lake. And even though that we were talking about things in the actual city site, they were still wanting to know exactly what we were doing and asking for copies of all the environmental stuff. Handed over everything to them. They were super happy, and they didn't ask for any more. As we went down the road with the site specifics, we continued to send them as we were looking at them, because they requested it that way, and that's how they cleared them. Other ones will clear it at the broad review if you're tearing. They'll let you know right up front that they don't care anymore. So again, I would start that out at the broad level. Sometimes you're going to have to follow it up on the site specific, but not always. But again, the utmost respect to them. And the TDAT site has both the locations of all this stuff, and on HUD Exchange, they actually provide you, again, with the template, and they've actually got a memo that talks about contacting them and has examples of project descriptions. So,
I think Sam had a question.
go for it.
Yeah, so probably need to look at the programmatic agreement more carefully, but if we are trying to utilize that, does that exempt tribal review, or do we still need to consult with tribes? And if so, do they still have 30 days? Does it?
Yes. The
So
tribes always have
what
30
does
days.
it expedite?
Sorry, can we have the questions repeated into the microphone? Our Skype participants aren't hearing the questions.
I'm just kidding. She's wanting to know if they're utilizing the PA, does it still require tribal review? And if it does require tribal review, is it the 30 days? So in the PA, does it address, I haven't looked at it close enough, does it address tribal
Because
at
I know
all?
we use
No,
a.
and Rob's gonna answer this.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Come right here so they can hear you and it will record.
So are you referring to the HAP program or the HRP program, or just in general?
In general, because we use a different programmatic agreement for the regular CDBG, and that just exempts all consultation. And so I was wondering if this is the same process or not, because now this is going through THC.
Okay, yeah. Which PA are you using?
Texas Department of Agriculture.
Okay, that may have to be reviewed by the GLO environmental team to see how it applies to that particular program. For the rest of the normal, I guess, CDBG that has not been done through a separate department, there's two aspects that are going on. One, this programmatic agreement that references Harvey, that THC and GLO negotiated, does not reference Native American consultation at all. So the normal Section 106 process applies. For those who are in the HAP program, the Homeowners Assistance Program, or the HRP program, there was new guidance that was put out. There was additional consultation between the GLO and all of the tribes. So there is no requirement for Native American consultation with those specific projects unless very specific conditions occur. So in that case, I'd suggest maybe giving a copy of the programmatic agreement to Celine and Jill and Cynthia, and then have to take a look at that and how it interacts with the CDBG funding.
Okay,
here.
so it would expedite the THC.
The SHPO. The SHPO,
The SHPO,
will be
but not-
expedited, but not the tribe.
Yeah.
Okay, so
So-
not all of Section 106.
Yeah, this
Correct.
PA
Correct.
is specifically for the SHPO consultation. Yeah. So-
Wesley, yes?
It's been my experience that TDAT is rarely ever updated, that the names of many of the chiefs or CEOs of the tribes, and quite often the TIPOs are not
Incorrect.
updated. When y'all look at the TDAT list, are you only looking to make sure we contacted the tribes, or do I need to document where I got the names of who we contacted? Because you can get that from Bureau of Indian Affairs, and
Oh, absolutely.
sometimes you can get it directly from the tribe themselves.
What we are looking at is we're looking to see that you actually contacted the tribes and you contacted the correct member of the tribe. Luckily, as we've kind of gone along, we've kind of kept our own list of who some of the governors, presidents, CEOs, whatnot, have changed to. So we're aware of who that person is as they're coming through. If you see any that change, we'd appreciate it if you would send us a note. We send that note and we forward that note to HUD to hopefully get them updated. And they do them periodically, but he's right. There's like one tribe that I've seen the same guy on there for, it's been changed for like 4 years, and he's
the
still on
Apaches?
there. Yes, exactly. Exactly. And there's a couple of them actually that have changed that drives me crazy. There's a few that they've changed and there's a few that they haven't, and I'm not sure why. But anytime that you see that it's changed, send us a note to let us know, because we're going to add that to our list of what we look at, because we want to let other people know. Because I know that when you send it out to the wrong person, a lot of the times you'll get something thrown back at you and they'll say, not here, or something to that effect. So you want to make sure that you have the correct person on there. Many times I'll just look up I'll do the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They're actually very good. There's a link off of THC that takes you over actually straight to that for that review. I also tend to look up the tribes individually to go on their website. And it is a little bit of an Easter egg hunt because they don't want to tell you, I've noticed. So you really have to hunt around to find that. But you can eventually find that, and you can always email them too. They'll usually have a main email address that you can let them know, I'm trying to send you some documents. How do I address them and who do I address them to? So just so you know, but yeah, we actually do look to see who's actually on there and if it's the guy from 4 years ago or the current one. So, as you're working in the same areas over and over again, you're creating your own list as well, so you know who actually should be in there. And they do have elections every year, so it could change every year. All righty. Any other questions? I think that's it. Okay. All righty. And just to reiterate, that PA is for the SHPO portion of the consultation only. That does not go to tribes, so you are still doing that 30 days. All righty. We're going to jump into noise real quick. Noise is mentioned at the site specific when you're doing any kind of broad review or if you're doing an overall review. But you can actually resolve at the broad level for a rehab or reconstruction program by citing the 24 CFR 51.101A3, yes, this will be very specific, disaster exemption, and there is one for that. And it's talking about providing for standard attenuation measures. On the other hand, for infill new construction on vacant land, to be part of the tiered review, you would need to require noise assessment and mitigate, I'm sorry, I didn't write this slide, so I'm looking at it going, what? And mitigate or reject new construction sites. Basically, if you're doing rehab or reconstruction, you can file underneath this for disaster. And FYI, this is for disaster for a declared event and also for disaster funding, okay? So don't make the home people insane thinking that you're going to do this, because they'll tell you no. So this actually goes to a disaster allocation. On the other hand, when you are doing like infill or new construction, you do look at noise. Any kind of new construction, you will be looking at that. And of course, we're talking about anything that has a noise-sensitive use. For HUD noise, and I'm going to go super fast past this because I want to kind of get down to the nitty-gritty when we go to like wetlands. Much like endangered species, that's something that we're going to hit a lot on, especially when you're doing those infrastructure projects. So I think that's a very important one that I want us to spend a lot of time on. For HUD noise, the majority of what you're doing, it's not a noise-sensitive use. If you're digging up a water line or a sewer line, I'm pretty sure it's not listening for you, so you're not going to have to worry about mitigating for noise. The only time we're really talking about noise is when we are talking about housing or shelter, anything that has to be with an overnight shelter. Okay, so if you're working on any of those kind of facilities where people actually spend the night overnight, that is a noise-sensitive use, and you have to be aware of that. Some of the guidance that we have back behind us here, you can see it's got the HUD guidelines, which again is HUD Exchange, as well as the worksheet, and they both have it for two different types of projects because they're looking at things that are CADX and things that are EA. Quick little kind of info on the noise standard. They're just trying to show you exactly what the levels are and the thresholds of pain. The HUD noise policy. New construction, prohibit HUD support for new construction of noise-sensitive uses on sites having unacceptable noise exposure that cannot be mitigated, preferably. Rehabilitation, encourage or strongly encourage noise attenuation features or convert to a land use compatible with those high noise levels. So if you're right outside an airport, do you really want to build the multifamily complex or the single-family subdivision? Land use, encourage land use patterns for housing and other noise-sensitive urban needs that provide a suitable separation between them and major noise factors. The noise evaluation, and somebody mentioned this earlier, so I'm just going to comment on that very quickly. When you're looking at noise, when you do have a noise-sensitive use, there are certain items that you're looking for in distances. You're looking at primary airports. Again, on that MPIAS map, it's going to be all those airports that are done by red icons. I believe it's a red star and a red triangle because they're looking at 10,000 emplanements or more, and that's generally what those are consisting of that are under those categories. When we're looking at that airport, you're trying to see if you're within 15 miles of that airport. If you are within that 15-mile limit, then you need to go get the noise contour map that they should have in place because generally they're looking at mitigation and they've done reviews and reports on and on and on. Many times you can find them online. I used to have like a little bit of a library of that at my old agency. It will prove out through the contours that you are not within that noise contour unless you're right next to the airport. For roadways, we're looking at it to whether you're within 1,000 feet from a major roadway. Major roadway does not mean I-35. Major roadway can mean Lamar Boulevard over here. It's a major roadway. It's something that has a high volume of traffic. So it's not necessarily only a highway. It's something that would be considered a larger place. Generally, they're looking at if you've got more than 10,000 vehicles on that average, okay, anything from 10,000 up. The only time you might look below that is if you have more than one noise source when you're doing that worksheet for noise. For railroads, you're looking at any railroads that come in contact within 3,000 feet. If you are something where you've got multiple tracks and they're parallel, then you'll pick out in between the two tracks to measure out. Military industrial facilities, in case there happens to be a shooting range nearby. Believe it or not, they actually have that kind of in that corner of New Mexico. So they have to worry about that. So if there's anything that has like high impulse noises or something like that, believe it or not, on that noise worksheet, they have a little spot that you click on and it adds 8 decibels and you're done. I actually had to contact HUD about somebody wanting to build a multifamily complex next door to a shooting range where people actually went outside and ran around and shot stuff that popped up at them. I know that sounded incredibly appropriate to me. And they were surprised that the people suddenly backed out when the county, who was apparently partnering with them, saw the video of the complex next door and said, I don't think so. But surprisingly, that seemed to be their only worry, was the noise. I thought that was super bizarre. All this stuff, when you're doing the calculation, you're actually looking at what's averaged over a 24-hour period, and they weight at 10 decibels for nighttime. That's already in the calculation itself. What you will have to do when you're putting the numbers into that calculation is for your roadways, is you're going to have to project 10 years in the future. So you're going to create something that projects that 10 years in the future. You can extrapolate it yourself in an Excel sheet. If you go on to the TxDOT site here in Texas, they actually have a statewide planning map that actually does show roads that are projected off. They project off 20 years in the future. You can use that one, or you can extrapolate your own, utilizing like whatever the specific growth rate is for your community. I actually have a cheat one if anybody wants a copy of it that I already created. There are estimated noise level for at least 10 years. I just already said that. I'm going too fast. I'm going to skip through. Why is there that thing? Sorry, I guess that's exactly what we missed, to cut out all the slides for that particular piece. So when you are conducting that noise study, the 5 pieces that you're going to be doing is you're going to determine whether it's a noise sensitive use. So are you looking at a home? Are you looking at a drainage ditch? Not a noise sensitive use, okay? A road, not a noise sensitive use. A household or a shelter that has overnight people, noise sensitive. Any kind of education, that would be noise sensitive. So if you got a community center that's primarily utilized for some type of local education. So to determine whether it's a noise sensitive use, then at that point look at the proximity to those 3 items I just talked to you about. Airports, roadways, railroads, and if there's some type of weird industrial thing. Generally we don't see a whole lot of that, but every once in a while we do. You're going to gather the data you need for that analysis, and then you're going to calculate it, what the noise level is, using the HUD noise calculator. Based on that calculated DNL, you're going to make your finding. It's going to be approved projects as proposed, require noise attenuation, or reject, which yes, they can reject that project. Anything that is below 65 decibels is considered acceptable. Anything between 65 and 75 is normally unacceptable and requires attenuation. If it's above 75, there's a good possibility that we could reject that project. We have to go through HUD headquarters to discuss it, and that could trigger an EIS. We're going to jump into sole source aquifers. Not something we're particularly concerned about, located over by Houston. If anybody's here from San Marcos area, possibly, there is an actual, so I'm not going to talk about it too much, there is an actual MOU between EPA and HUD, okay, that they've gone in and talked about specific types of projects. You can utilize this for your regular CDBG program and for your home program as well, that are talking about the types of projects that are going on that they do not require a consultation for. Some of those can be single family housing, but it depends on how scattered out they are. A copy of this was actually placed in the box section as well, along with your slides and other attachments. And I can find it in here, but I can't. Anyway, so be sure and take a quick look at this. You do have more guidance on HUD Exchange. HUD Exchange has everything. That's our one and only sole source aquifer in the state of Texas. We've got a lot of other minor aquifers, but that is our sole source aquifer. And even though the Chilcote aquifer system comes up and abuts, it's separated by the Sabine River. So no worries on that one. Alrighty, this is another interactive map that you can pull up. This is like EPA's ArcGIS based map, so you can actually hone in if you're not sure exactly how close you are to any of these items. So if you happen to be doing work over there. If you happen to fall into an area that is sole source aquifer and it's not covered by this MOU, then you will have to send off to EPA and get some type of response from them. Although they also, just like everybody else, has a 30-day window. If you don't get a response within 30 days, you're finished with that. Now, that doesn't stop them from coming back in 45 days and providing something to you. It's just saying at that 30th day, if you have all the rest of your things put together, you can then submit your ERR to us to look at and evaluate and allow you to publish. If they do come in, though, we do have to apply any kind of mitigation that they provide. The localities themselves, a lot of the times, already have that within there. Yes, ma'am.
So, the interactive website where it shows EPA says where the boundaries of the aquifer are different than what TCQ's sole source aquifer boundary. So we would refer to the EPA. And not TCQ.
TCQs is actually, there are two different kinds of aquifers that she's asking about, aquifer maps. There's one that TCQ does, and they do a pretty nice one actually, and there's another one that's done by EPA. This is the EPA guided map, and that's the one that HUD actually tells us to utilize. The one for TCQ actually goes to permitting, because there's some certain things that you will have to submit depending upon what you're doing in those areas. And again, and the difference between the two maps, to be honest, is they're not exactly the same. One extends out much further north than the other one does, okay? So it's heading up into Georgetown. The difference with those is a lot of those localities already have specific ordinances and regulations in place at their communities that they require studies or other things put in place before they'll actually allow them. Sometimes, not always, you will have to get some type of permit through TCQ. That's one of the reasons for the mapping. But you always check in with them to find out if that's a piece of it, because you don't want to get slowed down. All righty. So key project types that could have an adverse effect on a sole source aquifer. Shockingly, I know you wouldn't believe this, but cesspools, septic tanks, pit toilets, privately owned sewage systems, including those of a homeowners association. So some of those things could have an issue with whatever it is that you're doing. Continuing on to that, sanitary landfills. We're not going to do any of those kind of projects. Facility or operations which dispose of its wastewater into dry wells, retention ponds, okay, or methods other than that as a treatment plant. Stormwater drainage facilities. So the documentation for the ER for that point is you can utilize the MOU if you've got that in place, or you can simply, you guys are in Houston, simply show us the map and put a dot where Houston is, or Brazoria City or anywhere else of those places that are far, far away. And we know that you're not within that. And that's generally going to be something from the broader view. Wild and scenic rivers. And we're going to blast through this again, and I'm going to drag you up here for reference. Yeah, surprise! I love doing that. Did I mention? Alrighty, for HUD resources for the wild and scenic rivers. Again, it's on HUD Exchange. I'm going to say that over and over again. And actually, there is also a worksheet. That's a picture of actually our one and only wild and scenic river, which is located over here in the Rio Grande Big Bend area. Been there many times, and it is quite beautiful. However, that's not the only one we're supposed to look at in the state of Texas. For the systems that they're looking at, they actually look at 3 different types. They're talking about the categories of the protected rivers. We've got designated rivers, so those wild and scenic rivers. We've got study rivers, and then we've got nationwide river inventories. In Texas, we actually have 1 wild and scenic river, but we have 19 inventory rivers. So you have to be mindful about what kind of work you might be doing near those. So one of the things they ask you about is what type of projects you're doing. Is your project a water resources project? A water resource project is a federally assisted project that could affect the free-flowing condition of a wild and scenic river. Examples include dams, water diversion projects, bridges, roadway construction or reconstruction, boat ramps, and activities that require a Section 404 permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. Likely, I don't think you'll be doing any of this stuff, but who knows. There's portions of the Sabine River over there that are abutting up against Newton. That is a study river. If so, could the project do any of the following? Have a direct or adverse effect within wild and scenic river boundaries, invade the area or unreasonably diminish the river outside wild and scenic river boundaries, have an adverse effect on the natural, cultural, or recreational value of that NRI segment. There are consultation requirements. You'll contact the gentleman. I'm going to take it straight over to his, oh, I guess I don't. Sorry, I'm looking for the actual man's name. It's not on here, but we'll actually send that out when we send the other email blast out with the update. Even though we've already given you that lady's email, I still want to send that back out to you so you'll have it so you can click onto it. But we'll send that up there. The likelihood of you actually needing to do this is pretty small, but just in case. He's actually located in New Mexico, the gentleman that oversees this stuff. If you're within 1 mile of these pieces is when they're asking for you to look at consultation. But it also goes to the type of project. So again, if you're wondering about that, contact us. We'll check into it a little bit closer for you, and we can work on that with you. For ERR documentation, as always, we're looking at maps. Trying to see if we have it. We don't have it on here. We actually have, some of our previous consultants have actually created some maps for us that actually map out those sites. If you go on to the rivers.gov site, they'll give you segmentations, they'll give you descriptions. They actually have pieces, though, that you can drop down to GIS mapping and create those. So again, you can come in and you can go in close with those things. For this piece, what we're looking at is we're looking at mapping yet again. If you'd like a copy of that map, again, send me an email. I'd be glad to provide it to you. It's already created, and it's actually got an overlay of all the highways and streets and stuff, so you can kind of drill down to see how close you are. They actually have an interactive map on this site as well that you can go into yourself and take you down pretty close. Oh, look, wetlands. Come here. Wildlife biologist, don't you think it should be her?
So I noticed that Cynthia promised you'd be out at 4, and instead of letting you out, she put the hardest section for me to do at 4 o'clock with no time left. So I'm not really sure what to say about that, other than we will try to go through this quickly.
By the way, she's never seen these slides, so give her a break.
It's like I'm being set up here. Yes, I will go through the slides and be brief about wetlands. So the main difference, so can I just have a show of hands of who here has done nationwide permitting before individual permitting? How about a hands of who hasn't? Who has not? Individual permitting, nationwide permitting, Corps of Engineers? No?
Ooh, and I have
Okay.
a question. How many of you think you're going to have a permit for your project?
I think everybody should put their hand up for that.
Yeah, but you don't know. You're going to be surprised on the projects that actually will require that.
So the big difference is with HUD requirements, typically in the consulting world or other areas we're working in when we're not dealing with HUD funding, we really focus on jurisdictional wetlands, which means it's a wetland that is attached in some way or form by some sort of significant nexus to waters of the U.S. That means the Army Corps of Engineers takes jurisdiction over that wetland and determines what we can or cannot do with it and the required mitigation. The big difference here with HUD, and this is very important to remember, is that HUD considers isolated wetlands equally as valuable as jurisdictional wetlands and treats them the same. So if you see isolated wetlands on your project site, this includes, to the extent practical, man-made ponds, dikes, like strange things that typically you wouldn't think would have any sort of function or value, high function or value. HUD wants us to take those into account. So it's important when you're running your wetland delineation maps or using the NWI mapper, and especially in the field, that if you have any sort of isolated wetlands that will be impacted, they need to go through the entire 8-step process. Doesn't necessarily mean your project's dead in the water, but you will have to go through the process, and it may or may not include mitigation depending on the amount of impacts. Briefly, this is the National Wetlands Inventory Map that's available online, which is a good starting place. I think the data in these maps is somewhat outdated. So you can't just send us this map and there's a wetland here, but we don't think it's there anymore. We have this aerial Google map. It requires a little bit more of in-depth analysis just because of the nature of this data. So it's definitely, like I said, a good starting place, but it can't be the only way that you determine whether or not your project will have impacts on a wetland. Pretty much every project site within reason requires a field survey, which you can verify where the conditions are on the site. So if you have a wetland that you are going to impact, it will require to go through the 8-step process. And there's This diagram here that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with is available on the HUD website, and it's a flow chart that's really great and shows you the steps of how to go about accomplishing that task. I don't think we'll get into that a lot right now. Just know that it's there and it's a good resource that can help you walk through it, make sure that your analysis is correct, and as well as your publications.
And it's literally the exact same 8-step as the floodplain, okay? It's just for wetland.
So let's talk about permitting. We have a lot of projects we've seen recently that require a nationwide permit for impacts to streams as well as adjacent floodplains and wetlands. And again, I would say, and this is a really good take-home point I would like everybody to remember, is that the project description is key for everything that you're going to do for us. And so the best way for us to help you and pass these ERRs through quickly is to give us a really good thorough analysis in your project description, including the existing habitat and conditions on the site. With that, we can help determine whether your determination of what types of permits you might need from the Corps of Engineers, whether it's an individual permit or whether you can move through the permitting process under a nationwide permit, will be the big factor in how long your project's going to take. I think since the year and a little bit we've been here, we've seen one individual permit. Mostly everything can be covered under nationwide permit if your project is scoped correctly and you're using the right types of permits. The nationwide permit system is pretty generous, and there's an opportunity to also use more than one nationwide permit for a project. So for projects that involve stream bank stabilization as well as culvert replacement, you can use 2 separate permits for that. So if you run into a situation where your project is going to require an individual permit, which means it's going to exceed the thresholds allowed in the nationwide permit system, and you need some sort of individual permit with the Corps of Engineers, this is a really long process. And so you need to identify this at the very beginning of your ERR process and plan for it in your project schedule. I would say, Rob, correct me if I'm wrong, a year quite honestly, how busy we are right now in disaster recovery.
And FYI, for all those people that are listening out there, please be sure that you have your mic muted, because we're hearing somebody talking about the weather, is what I'm being told. So if you guys could make sure that your mics are muted, because nobody here is talking about the weather, and they can't hear Jill because they're hearing about the weather.
Okay, so I don't remember what I was saying. Individual permit, yes, 1 to 2 years. Individual permit is a big deal. It requires mitigation and a lot of time. So if you identify that there's even the possibility of that, you have to bring it to the project manager's attention for sure, because you do have a very tight, limited amount of time where you can expend these funds. And that said, you have to dive into the process very quickly. And Rob's probably right. It's probably closer to 2 years. So if you think about everything else you need to do in the ERR, and then get that permit and get it into the ERR for approval, you're really tight on actually getting the construction completed for that project. So heads up on that is something that you should pay attention to. And just like that, wetlands is done. Any questions with wetlands specifically? Nationwide permitting, that could be an entire one day on its own. So, yes, Tracy.
All right, so I guess I can ask you this, because it's not really clear. When it comes to wetland mitigation, like compensatory mitigation in the program, so it says that it's required if the impact, it may be required if they exceed an acre.
Right.
In size. So is that like a define, if it's less than an acre, then it's not required? Because that's kind of like or should you just go ahead and try and?
So the question was, there is documentation, I can't point to where right off the top of my head, that says for compensatory mitigation for wetlands, and you're talking about specifically isolated wetlands.
Yes.
requires mitigation, compensatory mitigation. It does, and the language surrounding that is very loose, you're right. There is not really a prescribed method, or I want to say the words they use is reasonable. They use that language, don't they? Reasonable compensatory mitigation, which is very subjective to what that is, and it is for over an acre. We've had only a couple projects where we've had impacts to wetlands, and again, as the responsible entity, you're ultimately responsible for proving out in your ERR that you have done to the extent practical and reasonable to complete all of these measures and components. And so personally, from a GLO standpoint and the projects we've been involved in, we have gone ahead and required mitigation or proposed mitigation for those areas. And because there's nothing written down on what is the most reasonable recommended, we kind of follow what the Corps would require. So the Corps presents pretty good science with function and value of wetlands. If you're impacting, PFO here, what do you have to do for a mitigation bank over here? How many acres? Can you find the same one? Can you use mitigation banks? So we've been recommending to the responsible entities and the vendors preparing reports for the responsible entities that they follow those same guidelines. It's something rather, it's not arbitrary. You're not inventing your own idea of what reasonable is, and we're actually following science that exists. So that's our recommendation. One last thing on wetlands, don't forget wetlands provide excellent habitat for certain species. So if you have isolated wetlands on your site, chances are your function and value of that ecosystem and how everything ties together increases, and you have also a higher chance of having endangered species, especially migratory birds. So that's something else to consider with wetlands as well. And again, the best way to deal with wetlands is to avoid them. If you can plan your project around, if you can shift the road 50 feet to the east, everybody would be really happy if that happened. Nothing else that I can think of about wetlands. Any other questions?
All righty, I would make you get up and stretch, but we're on environmental justice. And if anybody's looked at the old statutory checklist, that's the last piece. And then a quick little comment about EA, and then we're kind of done, guys. And again, if you think of questions as you're driving home, because I know you're going to be just going, oh, this was so awesome. Send us, go ahead and email us and ask us. If we're not sure of the answer, we will check with HUD, as always, to get their opinion on it. And by the way, HUD is listening, FYI, to anybody else that's over here on the Skype. And they're hearing you talk about the weather and other things. So please, please, please mute your mic. Check your Skype and check on there and mute it, because somebody's having a chat fest, and unfortunately, HUD's hearing everything. Just FYI, because they texted me. Alrighty, so we're going to go into environmental justice very quickly. The prove out for environmental justice, and I'm going to keep this slide up here for right now, is basically the entire review, okay? The entire review is looking to see what exactly we're doing. If you have impacts but you're able to mitigate for them, then you're not causing an issue, okay? You're not having to go deeper into it to look at whether it's a high minority or high poverty area, because everything that you're doing is positive, okay? The majority of the things that we're doing on our project, we're trying to create clean sanitary housing, clean water, sanitary sewer, and we're trying to save lives and save property by some of the mitigation that we're doing for flooding. So on that end, the entire review reflects for the environmental justice, and you can utilize that for part of your conclusion. If for any reason there's something that you can't mitigate for, that's when you have to take a deeper look and try to look and see exactly who's involved there. You may have to go further into it and actually hold public hearings and get the public involved. So again, we're looking at those issues. So if you're building in a floodplain and you can't mitigate completely properly for that, and that seems to be in an area that's a poor area of town, you might want to take a closer look at that. How is that not creating an issue with environmental justice? So it's anytime you're having to mitigate for something. Is it mitigating properly? So I know I used to see something on some of the old tax credit properties where they would talk about elevating, but then leaving the roadways below 6 inches below the base flood elevation, which made no sense to me, because you're flooding out somebody's vehicle, and also it really doesn't make sense if you're raising the entire property with fill. I don't know why you would make things slope around. So again, that's kind of how environmental justice works. Part of the problem, and this is kind of what some of the research groups have found as they've gone out, is that disproportionately we have put upon those areas that are typically poor or minority. So that's part of one of the issues as to why we look closer at this. And it can cause a whole lot of different areas and issues. I mean, you can look behind me. One of the reasons why we actually do look to see if you're in proximity of a dump, okay, or anything else like that, is because you've got people that are living nearby. Again, when we have those chemical fires and whatnot, and they're telling you to shelter in place, unless you have some super uber, system that's filtrating through your house, that's still coming in. You're still getting exposed to that. As a cancer survivor, I can tell you right now, I would not wish that upon anybody. So we do look for those pieces. Some other examples, just very quickly, that you can see in here, areas that are close to big, heavy highways with all that noxious fume that's coming out of the cars. You've got, and I've seen this many times when I've been reviewing something, the place next door that looks creepy, okay? So, if it's single family, they've been living there for a long time, I get it, because that's where they moved, and who knows, maybe that moved in after them. But if you're developing a park or a multifamily project, I have no idea why you would pick a place right next door to that. But then again, they pick some really interesting places sometimes. So what is an EJ community? Again, it's something that has a high minority concentration or a lot of low-income people. I'm going to skip through some of the stuff that HUD has been looking at, and if you are doing multifamily, and I'll touch on that a few different times, go to something that they call site neighborhood standards. That's something that's always submitted out there to HUD, and they actually do look at this piece for that when they're sending back and give replies. So that falls under there. That's part of what their little issues are for that. It also falls into the tribal consultations. That's part of one of the groups that they're looking at. That's part of the reason why we actually do reach out to them. And one of the things that HUD has been actually kind of making sure about, and we've all been looking at the fair housing. A lot of the times we've been working on those various reports for fair housing, and I'm trying to remember the whole full-on name for it. It's the
Affirmatively furthering fair housing.
Thank you. Affirmatively furthering fair housing. Thank you. Very hard to say right now at the end of the day. Anyway, they have a commitment to that, and that's part of what's going on. It's not fair housing if you're placing them in a bad place, or if you're placing something in that area that's going to create something bad for that subdivision or that multifamily complex. So what is the level of the review? These are some of the things that determine whether you have to go EJ. What is the level of review? Will there be unmitigated adverse environmental impacts, as I was mentioning? And are the adverse impacts disproportionately affecting the EJ population? So is this the only area that we're continually doing this? Some of the tools that we utilize, we have that EJ screen that you can pull up from EPA, HUD CPD maps, HUD user data sets, and NEPA Assist. NEPA Assist is awesome. It has all sorts of things. You can pull up all that same information on there. And again, your entire review is part of what you're doing for that EJ screen. For your ERR, again, you're going to look at, if you have that issue, a demographic analysis. If you don't, you're going to be referring back to the entire review itself, and maybe some mapping for minorities. They have the minority mapping that you can get through the EJ screen, or also poverty. They'll give you like what the and my brain is disappearing at the end of the day. They're giving you what the income levels are in that area. Okay, so those are some of the screens that you can pull out to prove out that this area is not necessarily an EJ community or there's issues. And again, as always, HUD Exchange, HUD worksheet that you can work your way through. Last but not least, the environmental assessment factors. And again, they have a whole good guidance for environmental assessment. Including an actual space that pops out to and walks you through the environmental assessment and talks about the various elements. Why environmental assessment factors? Good predictors of a project success, okay, is what they're looking at. They show how residents will interact in the community, shows how the community services and infrastructure will support the residents. Many times when I see things come in, they'll say, yep, they're going to get served by so-and-so, Water Supply Corporation, but they didn't tell me that they had the capacity. Do they have the capacity to take on those new users? Okay, if it's sewer system, do they have the capacity? Again, we're looking for internally and externally. What's the impact that the surrounding area has on that project and that project has on the surrounding area? Are they going to bump them up and put them over where they're getting the cautionary emails or letters from TCEQ saying time to plan for capacity for your water treatment plant or your wastewater treatment plant? You know, or now you're getting to that 90% level where they're looking for you to build a new plant. So environmental assessment factors, and I'm going to go very quick, there's only a couple of slides, I promise, and we'll get very close. Covers 4 major impact areas and 36 specific impact categories within those 4 areas. The 36 impact categories jog the memory of the reviewer, raise questions, and assure that all potential impacts have been considered. Note that some of the impact categories are also included on the statutory checklist, but again, you're looking at it from a different level at this point in perspective. A project may be in compliance with the provisions of a specialized law or regulation or executive order and still have an impact. And that's what they're asking about on this piece. They're asking about the impact. Is it a minor, a major, or no impact? If a subject category has been covered adequately on the statutory checklist, note in the space provided for documentation, and no further analysis is required for that environmental factor. But remember, it has to have been covered adequately on the statutory. How do you assess success? Impact of the surrounding environment on the residents, occupants of a project, impact of project on the surrounding environment, just as I just said. I don't know why he's coming close. Alrighty, so for the environmental assessment context, you have a statement of purpose and need, which is the why, explains why the goal the project responds, explains what goal the project responds to, important context for decision making, and project description. The who, what, when, where, and how frames the analysis. You're talking about existing conditions and trends, conditions on and around the proposed site that will be relevant for environmental analysis. So again, we're taking that bigger picture look. Impact types: minor beneficial impacts, no impact anticipated, minor adverse impacts which may require mitigation, significant or potentially significant impacts requiring avoidance or modification, which may require an environmental impact statement. Again, that could be high noise. Maybe you're taking out an entire wetland system. The goal and outcome of the EA: document that there is no EIS is needed because project impacts are not significant or adverse. If significant or adverse impacts are found, mitigate or consider alternatives. That's another piece of the EA, is that you're looking at alternatives always. Mitigation equals actions to reduce the effects of impacts. Alternative, other ways to achieve that same goal. That's very important. You don't just say it's a no action alternative, then they won't get this. That's not the response we're looking for. You have to provide a little more information. So talk about the possibility of putting it in a different site, a different design, or added features, okay? When they're looking at that, they're asking for findings, determinations, and approvals. That's another piece that we look at. When we're looking at that ERR and it's asking about are there any permits associated with the project, we're talking environmentally. We don't need to know that you're going to go get a construction permit. We already know that. However, if you're going to have to go get a 404 permit, that we want to know, okay? If you've already obtained your construction permit for floodplain, that's what we want to hear about. I don't want to hear about your construction permit, okay? So that's what we're asking you to list, and list them out. Don't just say a general statement. It actually has to list it out. On this, you can see that it's talking about the proposal as is, proposal as modified, and no action alternative. Again, back with the alternatives. And they talk about the cumulative impact of the project. So you're looking at all the pieces of those things that you reviewed, okay? So we're talking about wetland and endangered species and floodplain and how they all interact together, as well as noise, as well as EJ, as well as all of it. So you must identify and list conditions and mitigation measures necessary for approval. That's another piece of that review. You've got to place all that out there and lay it out very succinctly as to what we're doing. You know, it doesn't have to be 7 years ago. We're not looking for a giant document, but what we are looking for is enough information to understand exactly how you plan to mitigate that, okay? List all mitigation measures adopted by the responsible entity to reduce, avoid, or eliminate adverse environmental impacts and avoid non-compliance. Incorporate measures, conditions into project contracts, development agreements, and other relevant documents. That's incredibly important. Like I said, This isn't just a paperwork exercise. Whatever you find in here, if you're supposed to mitigate, you're actually supposed to mitigate, okay? We will be monitoring for that, and we've been talking about 100% monitoring, so FYI. So make sure that you do incorporate, again, I'm going to repeat it, measures and conditions into project contracts, development agreements, and other relevant documents. Identify staff responsible for implementing that and monitoring mitigation measures clearly in the mitigation plan. So know who's going to make sure that this happens for you. Don't just assume that you're going to let the construction contractor run with it. One of the other things you do in the A, you make a finding of no significant impact, hopefully. The project will not result in a significant impact to the quality of the human environment. Or maybe you're making a finding of significant impact, in which case that might signal a bigger and uglier review. All right, so once you've clicked on that, the ERR for documentation is going to be all supporting documentation for each resource assessed, additional studies, field inspections, list of resources, list of permits, public outreach, cumulative impact analysis, alternative analysis, summary of finding and conclusions. And speaking of that, when we create and we format, and you're submitting this to us in your document, we're looking for a PDF document. We're looking for your checklist all together up front. Don't cut it into pieces. It's the checklist itself, because people do cut it up. The checklist itself, the appropriate checklist, if you're categorically excluded or it's an environmental assessment, that checklist itself, there should be mapping that shows us where the project sites are. It could be 2 or 3 maps. You're getting in close to it and pulling out so we know where it's located. As well as that, then all the supporting documents that you're referring to, attachment A, B, C, in order of the checklist. Don't separate them out by all the letters over here, all my maps over there, all my correspondence over here. As pretty as that looks in a report, for the high volume that's rolling through and that we're trying to review, it makes it much easier for me to open up your document twice, look at your checklist, and compare to your support documents, and to go in order, because it makes it a much quicker review and we can find exactly what you're doing, especially if it's grouped off in attachment A has 5 attachments to it, because this is all part of that, okay? And it makes it much easier to understand what it is that you're saying goes with what. So many times somebody will put a whole bunch of stuff in there. We have no idea what that correspondence is about. It doesn't even explain who they sent it to or why. It's a letter from EPA, but I don't know. Was it for sole source aquifer? Was it for something else? Because they cover a lot of different things. So does TCEQ. Many times we will see like the division that you sent it into, and that helps. But again, we need to have that stuff spelled out. So in all one order, it'll make it a much quicker document for us. And it makes it less of an Easter egg hunt as well. Alrighty. Make sure that the preparer signs and dates this once the environmental review is complete. And if it's at an EA level, we need to have your certifying officer sign off on that, or somebody that they've designated. For sure, do they want on the EA, do they want it to be the certifying officer, or do they want it to be
The EA form
Yeah.
has to be the certified officer.
Okay, so then, because we had this discussion with HUD just the other day about signatures. So the EA form itself does need to be signed by the certifying officer, okay? So not their designee, but the certifying officer. The certifying officer, and they need to make sure that they date that. The original signed document and related supporting material must be retained on file with the responsible entity. So you're going to send us a copy of all that good stuff. So make sure you have a copy on file as well. We're not your repository for all things. You should have your own copy as well, because when HUD comes to monitor, they'll knock on your door before they come to our door. They'll check both of us, but they'll be checking on your files as well. All righty. Just putting that word out, mitigation, just because it was there. I want to put it out in the air. Don't forget, if you're mitigating, we are checking. Make sure you do it. And again, just to kind of give you, and it was at the beginning and it's at the end here, all our contact information. So this is the emails for each and every person that's here. You chatted with Jill, you chatted with Angel and Celine. David's hiding away. He's playing with his kids. So he's doing something good. And you met Christy over here, so if you've got any tiger concerns once we jump on there. Submitting electronically will be a wonderful thing. It'll make it a whole lot easier than dealing with Excel sheets and emails and box and weird sizes and stuff not uploading and all that good stuff. So we look very forward to that. Do you guys have any questions? I tried to talk as fast as I could towards the end. All right, if you think of any questions as you're going, oh my God, that was so groovy, on your way home, please send us an email.
Yes, and thank you. And in closing, I'd just like to say we appreciate everybody coming, and we really are trying to, we did this very last minute, and it's very rushed, but if anybody has any suggestions on specific components of this that we could break out and do another training, or even set up a Skype training for you guys that people could log in for a distance, for example, wetlands or core permitting or anything like that, please email me. My email address is up there with any comments or suggestions on this training, and we can try and tailor it a bit more and provide you guys more guidance and arm you with all the tools that you're going to need, because you guys are going to be very busy as well. So we appreciate the time. And
I apologize for the speediness,
Yeah.
but we wanted to get as much in as we could and as
Yeah.
fast as we could. So
yes,
hopefully we didn't make you completely insane.
yes.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Safe travels. Thank you, Cynthia.